when I was thinking about what to do today, I wasn't aware of the pedagogical focus of the conference, and I'm going to try and incorporate more pedagogical things as I go along. But when I thought about what I wanted to do today, I decided to call the talk World War II Today, which some of the undergraduates might not realize is an oxymoron. So one of the first things that you have to do with World War II with the students is to give them some dates, since most of them are aware of it. But I like to make sure that they know that the US involvement in World War II was from late 1941 to 1945, but that the war began in Europe in 1939, so that the European arena was longer. And then, of course, it's always a good idea to remind them that it's 2017, although I still occasionally goof and say 2016. So by the end of my comments, although this is not so much structured as a formal lecture as it is as a thought provoker and a lead into some discussion with you, by the end of my comments, I hope to make good the claim of contemporaneity in my title, that World War II Today is, in fact, always an apt title. My book, the image of which is on the screen, was called The War Complex, a title which I somewhat regret, but you know, I can maybe, although I don't totally regret it. For most of the time that I was writing it, I was calling it World War II and the Modern Imagination, to kind of imp off of Paul Fussell's wonderful book about World War I and the modern imagination. And then there was a moment when I was teaching in New York and had responsibility for 22 students in 2001, fall of 2001, when the book became called, in my mind at least, World War II after 9/11, a title that my publisher absolutely would not go with. And now, all these many years later, I kind of understand why. Although at the time I was quite incensed that they weren't willing to do it. And so we settled on the War Complex, and they gave it the subtitle World War II in Our Time. And I guess that's where I wanted to start my remarks today, focusing in on the our, in the our imagination. Because when you talk about, use a term like that, you're talking about a kind of cultural we, and there's some things I think to say about that. I just added 2 more bullet points. One of them is the personal, the familial, and we Americans. And I'm going to start there with the idea of we Americans, because our imagination is fundamentally a function of we Americans. And again, I need to ask, is the sound okay back there? Okay, sounds muffled here. And if I put this back here, is this okay? Okay, good. When you're talking about we Americans, it can mean lots of different things. That's not comfortable, so I'm going to take it. And by we Americans, I want you to include veterans, and I know that a lot of the students at Wake Tech are veterans. But I myself am not a veteran. I didn't serve in the military. I didn't even come close to serving in the military. Writing about a topic like World War II, that is a surprisingly disabling fact. I'm just going to say it. That many people will stake their authority for writing about World War II on the role that a parent or a grandparent played in the war, and I can't do that. I was also writing about our memory of World War II, or our images of World War II, as a woman, and that made a difference too. And in fact, that was very important to me, because it seemed to me that I did think about war in a way that was marked by the fact that I was a woman. I brought a mother's perspective to it. I brought a wife's perspective to it. And in many of the films, there's a chapter in the book on films, and the women in war films are always the things left behind, the things being defended. And there's always a kind of disconnect between the values that the warriors are espousing, which are very good values: loyalty to friends, patriotism, taking care of buddies. Those are perfectly good values. But there's a disconnect between what they're doing in the war and the values of women back home. So I was very conscious of writing this book as a woman, and that made a difference too. So what did my press do? This happens all the time. They sent me this cover, and I almost pulled the book because I said, this is about a woman's take on World War II. It's not a book which is aimed at World War II aficionados. It's in fact a book which is written from a fundamentally anti-war perspective, much as my whole identity is imbricated in World War II. There is an anti-war strain. And so they send me, the warrior looking out of the plane, and they were very proud of the fact that this was an aircraft that was actually flown in World War II. And I kept saying, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong. And they just didn't see it. But it was important to me that, and I'm pointing out right away that there was this disconnect. The second bullet point, I'm going to come in on the familial and the personal in a minute, but the last bullet point that I put up is important as well, because there is a sense in which the idea of we Americans, our World War II in our time as Americans, does not dovetail with the idea of us as citizens of the world. And that was a perspective I tried to come to at various points in this book as well. As I was writing this book, Susan Sontag published a book called The Pain of Others, and I was moved by that book and touched by that book. And there was a literary critic and a philosopher named Alain Badiou, who I will come back to later in the talk, who was writing about an ethics of empathy. And that was an idea that spoke to me a lot, and it seemed to me both something that was at the root of my wanting to write about World War II, but also something that war easily disrupts in ethics of empathy, because how, after all, can you be a fully empathetic being and go to war against other people? Okay, so I'll come back to that later. I divided my remarks into three parts. First, I'm going to talk about how World War II affects personal life, and I'll be using myself as an example because I have no one else to use. Although in the discussion period, I'd be very happy to hear about how World War II has impacted your life, which will vary quite a bit depending on your age and your situation. In part two, I'm going to hit some important themes from the war complex. In fact, the themes that were highlighted in the description of this lecture, the nature of cultural memory from World War II, and some stats for World War II. And I'll just say as a kind of preview that the memory of World War II, the cultural memory of World War II, does change. And if there's time later on, we can talk about some of the demonstrable ways that the memory of World War II has changed since about 1993, and then again after about 2005. But a lot of it stays really the same. What's remembered and what's forgotten about the war stays the same. And then in order to kind of detail some of the reasons why that might be a misleading way of thinking about the war, I'm going to talk about some statistics from World War II. And along the way, I'll mention some things that reinforce cultural memory, both in terms of remembering and in terms of overlooking. And then finally, and this is the trickiest part of this talk, I'm going to try and talk about World War II in today's news. And about 10 days ago, I knew exactly what I wanted to say. And then about 4 days ago, I thought, oh, maybe I have to change it. And then yesterday, I thought, oh my gosh, I have to change it again. So I'm just going to make some speculations on how World War II is impacting the news today. Okay, the image on the screen is a book that came out in 2010 called Bloodlands. And at first, until yesterday, I thought, well, that was a kind of random image to put up there, but now I no longer think it is. Bloodlands is a very, very detailed history of how Eastern Europe suffered during World War II, and how it was caught in a kind of pincer movement between Stalin's aggression and Nazi Germany's aggression. I mean, it was an incredible push-pull that these people were caught in, and some of the appalling statistics for civilian casualties in World War II come directly from the fact that Eastern Europe was in the crosshairs. And of course, this is one of the ways that World War II is in the news again today, since much of the drama of Russia and Ukraine is a recursion to the way that Stalin once viewed Ukraine. So that will come up again later as well. The author Timothy Schneider, by the way, just published a book called On Tyranny, which is not so scholarly, but which is very polemical in very contemporary political terms. Okay, so that's me in the author photo from the war complex, and it's what, it's 11 years ago, and time has passed. But the cultural we begins with the personal, and so I thought I would just say a little about that. I was born in 1949, so baby boomer, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, to a very, very working class family. I would even say lower working class family. And so one of the ways that World War II impacted my life, and I was aware of it pretty early on, was by virtue of making education available to me. After Sputnik, there were a lot more college scholarships than there had been. And when I was ready for graduate school, which was in 1970, there was something called the NDEA Awards, and the NDEA Awards presumed that you would be extremely valuable to the nation as a teacher of the humanities. Something that doesn't happen anymore. And I was given a generous sum of money to go be a graduate student in Columbia, and I said, hey, that sounds pretty good. So I did it, and I might not have become a college professor if there had not been Sputnik, and if there had not been tension between the US and Russia, the Soviet Union, as a result of World War II. So that's one way it impacted my life. But if you think about all of the many social changes that followed World War II in America, the GI Bill, college education for a much wider segment of the population, suburban homes. Many of you probably grew up in suburban homes or have grandparents who own suburban homes. Suburbia is very much a post-war phenomenon. The prosperity and growth of the middle class through the 1950s and 1960s. All of these are part of the legacy of World War II. We don't tend to think of them because they're so quotidian, but they are part of the legacy of World War II, and were definitely there for me. Those are my parents, Sal and Rose DeMarco, and this is their engagement photo, which was taken on the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed. They were having their engagement party, and this became part of the family legend on the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed. And it obviously cast a mood over the engagement party, and I heard about it often as a child. They got married the following year on July 4th, and I never actually asked them about why July 4th, but it would seem obvious it was a patriotic gesture, unless it was my mother's ironic comment on the fact that she was the oldest daughter in an Italian family and would have had to take care of her father unless she had gotten married at the age of 32. My father was eligible for and took exemption from military service, and he worked instead on defense projects. And that, as I've said, is just one of those things that's true. And one of the things I did in writing the war complex was to take a survey of what various parents had done, friends' parents, and I got interesting stuff back, some of which made it in and most of which did not. But nonetheless, World War II was an active participant at our dinner tables. And so one of the things I sometimes ask students is how they remember World War II, and mostly they don't, but they do have certain family memories that will pick up on World War II. My family was a Children of Europe are starving family, so we kept hearing about that, although the Children of Europe hadn't been starving for a while. My father was also very taken with the fact that his best friend had been a paratrooper in World War II, and so he talked a lot about his friend Vic's vicarious experiences as a paratrooper. And my grandmother, after whom I am named, Mariana DeMarco, was apparently very good at food rationing and was able to use food rationing, and the family never had anything other than abundant Italian meals all during the war. My family was very, very into watching documentaries about World War II. And so at a relatively young age, I was fairly well educated about World War II because we were always watching these documentaries. One was called The World at War, and I still remember it vividly, and it went over every battle, most of them in the Pacific, and then of course ended with Europe. And then if it came back to Japan, I don't remember. And the other was called Their Finest Hour, which was about Winston Churchill and the Brits during the Blitz. And these were very important to my imagination, and I'm sure part of the reason I know they're part of the reason I wanted to write about World War II, because it was a very it was a counterintuitive move for me to write about World War II, and in some ways a very costly one, but I did it anyway. But I think the real reason that I wanted to write about World War II, again, goes back to the personal. Being born in Bensonhurst, which was overwhelmingly a Jewish and Italian neighborhood, where I saw, women and men with blue tattoos on their arms, and always wondered what those were about. When I was a little bit older, the movie Judgment at Nuremberg came out, and as part of that movie, there are brief clips of concentration camps shown as part of the movie. And I remember very vividly a woman breaking down in the audience and just crying and screaming, "Look what they did, the murderers," and leaving. And as a kid, I was extremely mesmerized by that and began to form a kind of empathetic identification with the Holocaust and with Jews. That was, I think, the first of the empathetic imaginations that I was able to form. And that also, I think, was a very consequential one in my life, since I've married into a Jewish family. One of my daughters is Jewish, and the other is not. So the Holocaust was a theme for me all through my life, and I wanted to come back to it in writing about the war complex. The other thing that I have a very, very vivid memory of, and I didn't really realize it until I was researching the book, was the trial of Adolf Eichmann. But when I was researching the trial of Adolf Eichmann, I went to Life magazine, and I was reading it, just the hard copy. It's always better to read these things in hard copies, because you see all kinds of things that you wouldn't have seen. And I was turning the pages, and I suddenly realized I know exactly what's on the next page. I know what picture is going to be there. I know where it's going to be on the layout. So I realized that I had spent a lot of time poring over Life magazine, which was one of the cultural enrichments that my parents had been able to provide for me. And I spent a lot of time on reports of Eichmann's abduction and trial. And to write the book, I went, of course, beyond Life magazine. I read all of the transcripts, every word. I saw every film. But that was a very strong personal memory, which also was filtering in here. Okay, now, again, when you teach students about World War II, if you ask them why America fought World War II, some of them may say because we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, but most of them will say we fought it to end the Holocaust, to prevent the Holocaust. And that's a kind of common misperception, which is just kind of out there. And of course, it's not true. But the Holocaust has, in a way, become one of America's stakes in the war by virtue of the National Holocaust Museum and movies like Schindler's List. And so it's an understandable misperception, but it is a misperception. When you ask them who Adolf Eichmann is, by the way, they say he was Hitler's right-hand man. And you kind of say, well, not so much. But they have him mixed up with Goebbels, for instance. They can't see the difference. The other historical event that was impinging on my perceptions of World War II and impinging on my life, and here I think it's most of our lives, was 9/11, the 9/11 attacks, when, as I said, I was teaching in New York and had responsibility for a lot of students. Almost immediately upon the World Trade Center attacks, the analogy with Pearl Harbor surfaced. I was a little cynical. I was in New York. There were soldiers, with machine guns on the streets almost immediately. The neighborhood I was living in was closed down to traffic. The analogy that came to my mind was the Germans watching the Reichstag burn. But I realized, that one's not right. And then the soldiers disappeared, and so I was quite reassured. But the analogy with Pearl Harbor surfaced right away. Some of the similarities to World War II took a little longer to realize. One of the things that disappeared from the streets of New York about the same time that the soldiers did were refrigerated trucks, which were being stored throughout the city, especially in downtown neighborhoods like the one I was living in, to collect the corpses which people were anticipating would come out of the wreckage at Ground Zero. And then they disappeared. And it was at that point, and of course everyone who was in New York will talk about the smell that was in the air, terrible smell, and it just didn't go away. So it was about that time that I realized that one of the similarities between World War II and 9/11, and I think a psychologically potent similarity, was that bodies had been burned, and they had been burned unto vaporization, so that there would be a disruption of the normal funerary rites and the kinds of rituals which can provide individual and communal comfort in situations like this. And so that was something that I focused on. There were also a lot of other things that kicked in after 9/11, which I did not like then and still don't like now. One is a kind of stark vocabulary of good and evil. I mean, I think we've become too accustomed in our political life to branding certain things stark evil and not being willing to think about slight nuances in between. One I absolutely hate, and I've always hated it, is the adoption of the term homeland, which is very resonant with German ideas of the fatherland, the homeland, the blood and folk. It seemed to be an unfortunate term, but it's now part and parcel of American life too. So it can't. There's nothing that can be gotten away from there. But I do feel that both of those developments, the homeland vocabulary and the vocabulary of evil, have kicked into the kind of Islamophobia, which is now, I think, part and parcel of American life and European life as well. And I guess one of my major points in the war complex became that 9/11 was manipulated for political purposes, and that American fear was capitalized on that year through about 2005. And I'm going to say a word which was very big in 2001, which is never uttered anymore. Anthrax. Do you remember anthrax? Well, everybody was terrified of anthrax in 2001. It turned out to be, we're not sure, I don't think we'll ever be sure exactly what was going on there. But it was just an example of how the population was susceptible to fear. And things happened as a result of that fear. And it kind of fit into the thesis that I'm developing today, that analogies with World War II make things happen. They're not just sort of around, they make things happen. This is a pretty flattering picture of George W. Bush, a president I've become fonder of, but I did not like during his term. This is a less flattering portrait of George W. Bush. If you saw Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11, this is George Bush reading My Pet Goat for the 7 minutes after the second plane went into the World Trade Center. And he doesn't know what to do. And I picked the image because I think America didn't know what to do. And there was a kind of paralysis after 2001 in which public discourse in newspapers, public discourse in universities, public discourse in America just kind of quieted down, and any kind of dissent on political opinion was perceived as unpatriotic, which it need not have done. And then as we ramped up to the invasion of Iraq, which just had an anniversary, because the invasion was March 20th, 2003. As we ramped up to the invasion of Iraq, there were, again, the analogies with World War II were all over the place. And if you don't remember these, we really should. One of the things we were being told was that Iraq was developing bombs, and they might do to us. They might drop bombs on us, right? Remember that? Do you remember Bush's 2003 State of the Union? He went through a detailed list of everything that might happen to us and to our families. Chemical weapons, nuclear bombs, germ warfare, all kinds of stuff. Bombs in suitcases. That was all listed in the State of the Union address. And it was a very detailed politics of fear. And I don't think it's even controversial at this point, or at least I hope it's not controversial, to say that we invaded Iraq under false pretenses. That it was a mistake. It was enormously consequential for America in terms of its morale, its place in the world, its financial condition. It was enormously consequential for the veterans who fought there. And it was enormously consequential for the Iraqis and the Middle East in general. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the current extraordinarily messy situation in Syria in Libya, in Somalia. None of that might have come to be if we had not invaded Iraq in 2003. And again, the analogies with World War II made it happen. Because I don't know whether you remember this, but again, we were told the Iraqis would welcome us like victors. The Allies coming into Paris, the women would bring flowers. This didn't exactly happen. The day that we invaded Iraq was compared to D-Day. That was an analogy that was around everywhere. And again, these analogies to World War II, they're not impotent. They make things happen. All right, so that was an important thesis of mine in the book. I'm not going to bother reading it because I think I've said enough about it. But one of life's little ironies is that academic publishing takes a lot of time to happen. So I perceived all of these wonderful things in 2001. Yay, me! And the only reason I perceived it was that I was thinking about what was happening in terms of World War II. But by the time the book came out in 2003, many more people had articulated those ideas, and they didn't seem quite as startling as they might have done. Okay, so I thought I would like to talk about cultural memory as it exists around World War II. And this slide is going to go up all at once. What do Americans remember and celebrate about World War II? And the remembrance, the celebration, oftentimes followed by memorialization. And that's true in almost every case in terms of books and actual physical monuments. Americans remember D-Day. They do. Americans remember the greatest generation, the idea of citizen soldiers fighting against totalitarianism. And that's true to a certain extent. Most of you probably know that segregation was in force during World War II, and that up until the end of the war, African American soldiers were given duties like burying the dead on D-Day. And Japanese American soldiers were not allowed to fight in the Pacific and were given some of the most dangerous duties during the Battle of the Bulge. So it's true, but certainly America was all about multi-ethnic soldiers fighting against totalitarianism. One of the things that's always remembered about World War II is its effectiveness for preventing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that's by virtue of the Nuremberg trials, which were held by all four of the Allies, but the United States was an important leader in it. And the gateway crime, and I'll come back to this, the gateway crime at the Nuremberg trials was conspiracy to wage aggressive war, so that you did not get to war crimes or crimes against humanity until you had met the criterion of conspiracy to wage aggressive war. The Holocaust is an evil is something that everyone and Americans remember very much. Although, you know, it's again, the last week maybe not so much. But the Holocaust is an evil. And something that's said routinely, genocide should never happen again, although in fact it's happened a number of times since. The iconography of D-Day is very, very strong. D-Day has movie footage that was taken by director John Ford, the director of Westerns and war movies. And it helped to establish a very strong iconography. The Life magazine war photographer Robert Capa came aboard with the second wave on D-Day, and many of his images are also iconic. Although many of his images were also not allowed to be shown because until 1943, you were not allowed to show dead American soldiers. It was considered too demoralizing to the home front to do that. But the iconography of D-Day is very strong. The troops landing on the shore, the difficulty of some of the beaches, like Omaha Beach, where the bombing went astray. Have any of you been to the Normandy beaches? The topography is amazing. And it's amazing topography. Very wide beaches. It's a vast expanse for the invasion. The weather is very, very changeable, which is one of the things that made the invasion difficult. In retrospect, Americans remember D-Day as a kind of inevitable success. It was going to happen. In fact, it easily could have failed, and there was no backup plan. Once the soldiers were on the beach, no plans were made for removing them from the beach if things went wrong. The German forces had been degraded to a certain point at that point by June of 1944, but still it was not a certainty. And one of the things that surprised me when I researched D-Day was that D-Day was just one of many events in the news that day. Rome fell on the same day, and that occupied a lot of space in the newspapers. And everybody said in the newspapers that they didn't know whether D-Day had succeeded yet. It would take, they were estimating 5 weeks. In fact, they were sure closer to that. But they weren't sure that the invasion had succeeded the day that the invasion occurred. And that's not the way that it's portrayed in cultural memory. How many of you have seen Saving Private Ryan? Yeah, most people. How many of you have seen The Longest Day? Okay. Having done research, Saving Private Ryan is closer to the truth than The Longest Day. Although The Longest Day has a lot of virtues as well. I'm going to come back to D-Day later when I want to do some statistics. But first, I want to focus on 2 events that have not been remembered as much, and to speculate on why. And here, for some reason, oh no, they're not up. There we go. Wait a minute, I'm going backwards, I'm sorry. Okay, now, to say that these are forgotten events is inaccurate. I put a mushroom cloud on there because they're not forgotten events. It's just that they register differently in cultural memory from the ways that would be, strictly speaking, accurate. So the first of these events, which I'm calling hiding in plain sight, they're known, they're demonstrable, they're provable, but we don't talk about them the same way, is the existence of internment camps for Japanese and Japanese Americans. That did not become widely known until 1973 with a book called Farewell to Manzanar. And I have to say that when I began work on this book, I didn't know it. But when I mentioned it to a friend who was of Japanese origins from the West Coast, she knew all about it because her father had been caught up in it. So there's some differences in cultural memory depending on ethnicity and West Coast versus East Coast, but by and large, not widely talked about, the Japanese internment camps. There was a play on Broadway that opened and closed real fast this year because Americans aren't interested in it. Second thing that America does not tend to talk about, it comes up and then it disappears. The incendiary bombings of cities in Germany and Japan, chiefly Tokyo. It's mentioned in Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, which does a lot of other things as well. The wonderful German-English writer W.G. Sebald talks about it in ways that are quite compelling. And there are books on the firebombing of Dresden, but they come and go very quickly and don't get a lot of publicity. And this will sound, I'm going to have to justify this one, I know, but the idea that the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Of course, do we know that? Of course. Is it part of our celebrated cultural memory of World War II? No. And then something that I also want to talk about in more detail, the vital role of the Soviets in defeating the Nazis and the really massive Soviet losses during World War II, which are conservatively estimated at 20 million, conservatively. And as I was writing about these things, I wasn't sure what to call it. Is it repression? Is it denial? I decided it was a persistence of a kind of wartime consciousness long after the end of war, where there are certain things you really just can't think about because they're too painful, they interfere with the clarity of patriotic emotion. And I was very intrigued by those things and wanted to probe more. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the atomic bombing in more detail, and then Russia in more detail, and then come back to D-Day. All right, so what is known but suppressed, the atomic bombings? Why is it suppressed? Well, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not that many people had cameras to run around with or the time to take photographs. So the number of images, in fact, is rather scanty, and the quality of the images is rather poor. But at the same time, Americans, when they occupied Japan, did not allow those images to circulate. I've already mentioned that the gateway crime at Nuremberg was conspiracy to wage aggressive war. That was not an accident. Americans were very aware that they might be accused of war crimes for dropping the atomic bombs. But if you make the gateway crime conspiracy to wage aggressive war, America had not done that. We had entered the war after having been the victims of aggression, not because we were the aggressors. So that was a deliberate crafting of the charges and part of what instantiates what I've called the war complex. I found this very surprising. Those of you who are English professors, passive voice is almost always used when describing the atomic bombs. Atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Common usage. At the Imperial War Museum in London, I thought this was hilarious. When you walk into the Imperial War Museum, you're facing an image of the of a mushroom cloud, but it's all about the dangers of radiation with no mention of the explosions. The actual bombings are like down here on a stairway, and the passive voice is used, and atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I thought that was so striking. Maybe that's not so surprising that that would be the case so close to the war. But in 1995, the Smithsonian Museum was installing the Enola Gay, and they wanted to include some Japanese testimonials, maybe 10 of them, under photographs. And there were massive protests, and the photographs and the testimonials were removed. 1995 is a long time after the war. And then, two more examples of this. Oh, sorry. Oh, what'd I do? Sorry, this is a new computer, and I should have practiced a little bit more on it. There was a book published in 2010. Yeah. There we go. There's a book published in 2010 called Last Train from Hiroshima by an author named Charles Pellegrini. And I read the book because I was still avidly reading everything about World War II, even though I was not actively writing about it anymore. And it was really helpful. It had all kinds of information about the bombing that I didn't know. And James Cameron, the guy who did Avatar, was going to make a movie of the book. So this was looking very promising. And then it was revealed that, and this is part of the weird psychology of the event, that one of the men who Pellegrini had interviewed, who had claimed to be on the Enola Gay, was not on the Enola Gay. This is bad if you're the author of a book like this. So, but I'm a different kind of author, so I counted up the number of pages. It's like a 550-page book. There were about 25 pages that are based upon things that this guy had told you, so a small portion. Normally a book like this would be recalled and corrected. It was taken off the shelves. It's disappeared. It's not sold anymore. There was one other thing that Pellegrini was guilty of, which is that he said he had graduated from one college where he had graduated from another college. Again, it happens. It's normally not the sort of thing that makes a book disappear, but in this case, the book disappeared, and this is 2010. It's pretty recent. In about 2005, I wrote an editorial about what I thought was a very innocuous op-ed about the bombing at Nagasaki, really just saying, oh, remember that this happened, and it had consequences in America's psychic life. And I got hate mail like I've never gotten. I mean, it was incredible. I got photographs of myself with my eyes poked out. I got photographs of myself with X through. I got somebody who said that they were going to have a barbecue on July 4th, and the chicken would smell like the Japanese did burning. I mean, it was horrible stuff. And again, I thought, it was incomprehensible to me that Americans could have that strong a negative reaction to merely the mention of something which is really just history. All right, here are just two images of the events that are not so memorialized. The top is Hiroshima after the bombing. That's the site of the Hiroshima Memorial now, which has obviously been built up. Has anyone been there? It was really interesting. It was a very moving experience, but I was quite surprised by two things. And of course, these are always maybe just happenstance. My husband and I were the only Americans there. Everybody else was Japanese, and there were some Australians running around. So that was very surprising. A lot of Japanese bring their children to show them, the children's shoes, the boxes, the relics of Hiroshima, and that was surprising. And then the third thing that was surprising to me is, again, as somebody who had written this book, was the extent to which the citizens of Hiroshima claimed responsibility for the bombing. They said it was justified in more than one place in the museum because they had entertained troops during the war. And I thought, how strange, Americans would never say that. We entertain troops in our homes, therefore we deserve to be atomic bombed. It seemed to me a very, very interesting kind of thing. And I had a very strange shame reaction when I was at this museum. Okay, and then the bottom are images from Dresden, the firebombing of Dresden. Students like to know what incendiary bombing actually does. Incendiary bombing burns wooden buildings, yes, but the purpose of incendiary bombing is to suck the air out of bomb shelters so that more people die of suffocation in bomb shelters than die from flames in incendiary bombings. So one of the first things that had to happen in Dresden after the firebombing is you had to get, those are all bodies on the street. You had to gather the bodies up and you had to dispose of the bodies in a way that wouldn't have allowed for disease. And again, the quality of the photographs is very bad. Things were not too orderly in Dresden right after the bombing. If you've read Victor Klemperer's wonderful diaries, he escapes internment in a concentration camp because he was supposed to be taken the day after the bombings, and he and his wife just decided to slip away with the other refugees at this point. Anyway, those are some images that are you may not have ever seen. Some of you probably did, but some of you may not have. All right, so I thought, I'm blathering on here. I thought maybe it was time to lighten things up with some statistics from World War II. I tell you, talking about World War II, it's tough. The statistics are really, really, really horrible. Anyway, here are some statistics from World War II. And a lot of times people will contest the statistics, and I need to say right out front that these statistics can be reckoned up in different ways, and you will find contradictory statistics. I've built some of that in. England lost 60,595 civilians killed and 82,182 seriously injured. I love that there's a precision to those numbers, right? They're very big numbers. These are terrible numbers, but there's a precision to them which tells you that they were compiled by a country that had not broken down and that had not suffered devastation to the extent that made counting bodies impossible. The USSR had casualty figures, I kid you not, of 20 million, and some experts bring that up to 40 million, which is astonishing, that kind of range. Military losses are generally listed as 8.7, but some historians within Russia say the actual figure was closer to 14 million. And again, that's an enormous range and tells you that things were maximally chaotic. And after Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the bodies were piling up so quickly that nobody gave a damn. And many Russians were dying in prison camps, and nobody could count those either. Poland, you can see those, and those are Jewish and non-Jewish civilians. Germans' civilian losses range from lows of 500,000 to highs of 3 million. And I couldn't believe those, but so I checked them multiple times. Dead because of Allied bombings, the average figure is 600,000 civilians, 600,000 civilians. And German military losses range, again, rather large. I don't quite understand why these range so widely, but the most reputable the figure is 3.5 million. Of course, that has to be an approximation. It's too precise. Now, the United States is another very interesting stat. The United States had 60 million troops in World War II. 292,131 died in battle. And a rather large number, 115,187 died outside of battle. And when you look at the aggregate numbers, which are sometimes published, they're very close. So these are the actual statistics. And that's kind of surprising. And then, of course, the Shoah, the Holocaust, the traditional figure is 6 million. It ranges from a low of about 4.5 to a high of 10 million. Okay. I probably should have done this before I put what was on the board. If you have a piece of paper handy, this is something I do with my students. I want you to write down the number of Americans killed on DDay. Your estimate. if you're willing to cooperate, as students sometimes aren't, but you're professors. How many of you have 50,000 or more? Okay. How many of you have between 25,000 and 50,000? How many of you have less than 25,000? Okay. How many of you have less than 15,000? Less than 10,000? Less than 5,000? Okay. That's a fairly representative group, a little bit but more informed than most groups. Interesting. These are the actual statistics for D-Day, and it seems stupid, but it took a lot of trouble to compile these statistics. It took me a very long time to kind of work them out. Just for some comparisons, the first day of the Somme, 60,000 attackers were killed or wounded. A single day in Antietam, I don't know which day, 23,000 died. In the Battle of the Bulge, which followed D-Day and was much more extensive temporally than D-Day, 70,000 Americans were killed. So it was a significant American loss. American and Allied casualties and deaths, 4,900 from 175,000 men ashore on D-Day. That's an astonishingly low statistical rate. I mean, of course, each death counts. That's one of the points that I think one always has to make. Each death counts, and if it's a relative, it counts a lot. But that's a really successful invasion. The American deaths and casualties in combat on D-Day, casualties and deaths were 3,581, and Americans killed on D-Day, because of D-Day, 2,403. That was much lower than I thought. And I think it's much lower than most people thought. I didn't bother parsing it all the way down, so some of you may have in fact known the actual statistic, but that was certainly lower than I thought. And one of the reasons that it was lower than I thought is that the American cemetery at Colville, which is the cemetery you always see when speeches are being given on D-Day, has 10,000 graves in it. And those are graves from the Battle of the Bulge as well, but they don't bother saying that, and it gives the impression of greater American loss. And you assume a certain number of Americans weren't buried in France but were shipped home. So you always think that more Americans were killed. Just by way of comparison, in 9/11, 215 died on the planes, including the 19 terrorists who were responsible for the attack, 2,606 in the World Trade Center, and 125 in the Pentagon. So surprisingly close, statistically speaking. And I think that's one reason why both these events sort of resonate. The lower the losses, the more you can focus on the individuals, you know what I mean? When the losses are so huge, you can't focus on the individuals, whereas memorials for 9/11 definitely focused on the individuals, naming them, giving histories. Okay. Second thing that I wanted to focus on, at least briefly, again, hiding in plain sight, the Soviet role in World War II. First one is totally obvious. We were allies during World War II. By the end of the war, it became quickly apparent that the Soviet Union was going to be America's post-war adversary. And one of the things that began to take place, beautiful photograph, by the way, of the Russian troops in Berlin. A great use of foreground and background. One of the things that began to take place very quickly after World War II was the idea that, well, who was most responsible for the victory? And America entered the European arena very late, 1943 in Italy and then 1944 in Normandy. Didn't have that many casualties. Russians had enormous casualties and had been having them since 1941. So if it was a matter of who had suffered most, who had suffered the most losses, Russia was clearly the winner, right? In terms of who had suffered more, who had more, who deserved more after the war in some sense. And so one of the things that happened, I feel very sure, is a kind of amping up of the memory of D-Day to stake America's position. Now, America's position is staked by other things, like the Marshall Plan, which was enormously consequential and enormously beneficial to Europe. But it's, people don't walk around and say, hey, remember the Marshall Plan? But they do say, remember D-Day. I actually have never seen a Marshall Plan commemoration in America, whereas D-Day commemorations are pretty abundant, and the Marshall Plan was very, very important. Now, something I don't think most Americans understand or understood during the Cold War and understand now is that Russia took all that land after World War II because they wanted to have an empire, sure. But they did it especially because they never wanted aggression from the German territory side of Europe again. And the more space they put between themselves and German aggression, the better. If you haven't been to Berlin, one of the really interesting things in the former East, the degradation of the former East Berlin was quite deliberate. The Soviets didn't care about the Germans. They really didn't care about them. You can still see many of the buildings still have scars on them from the war. They just didn't build up East Germany the way that West Germany was built up by the Americans and the Allies. Okay, so there's that. And then I get into this stuff, and when I was teaching, I was teaching Dr. Strangelove, and I started researching the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a kind of important historical event around it. Everyone is aware of the brief negotiations which led to that weekend, which prevented nuclear apocalypse. The negotiations were, in fact, much more extensive than that. And Kennedy did something absolutely brilliant. Khrushchev was giving him an ultimatum, and it was an ultimatum that left him nowhere to go. So he pretended he hadn't seen it. It's like in Victorian novels, the letter goes under the carpet. He pretended he hadn't seen it and sent back a conciliatory message, and that led to the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. What I did not know, and what is not widely known, some of you may know it, was that America had put missiles in Turkey. That's when Russia put missiles in Cuba. And the Cuban Missile Crisis wound down when America agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey, as well as the Soviets removing their missiles from Cuba. So in other words, it was a quid pro quo, whereas it was presented as a kind of one-sided victory. So, and all that has to do with the role of the Soviets. Until 10 days ago, I was sure that the impact of World War II in the news today had to do with America's views of Russia and how we viewed Russia and how Russians viewed the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. And so I began with the first bullet point, which I think is still true. All the post-war generations, from the boomers to the millennials, have seen war, and some of them have been pretty ugly and intensely divisive wars like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. But we haven't seen world war. And as the numbers I've been putting up on the board will tell you, there's a difference. There's a difference. There's an enormous difference both in terms of time, loss, and impact. And so the next bullet point, I was mulling over what had protected us. Was it NATO? Was it policies of mutual deterrence? Was it the economic union? Was it the economic interdependence which has characterized the recent world, which once characterized the world before World War I? It didn't work then, but it had been seeming to work now. And so when I was originally drawing up these remarks and finalizing these remarks less than a week ago, I thought that I could say, what will the current administration's policies of America First do to these protective devices? But now I had to add this morning, what will be the situation what was the situation last week? We know that. What's the situation today? We could probably go online and check that. What will it be next week? I don't know. Because yesterday, apparently, NATO ceased to be useless and became useful again, so that's good. The EU apparently is going to break down, and that's going to lead where it's going to lead. Economic interdependence, the policies keep changing, so it's very hard to know where that's going. The one thing that I think I can still say, and which is consistent, I hope, with the rest of my remarks today, how will American nationalism define the term with which I began, our imagination? As we Americans, what do we mean when we say America First? Do we mean America's our country and we love it? Yay! Do we mean screw everybody else? Maybe not so great. So there's a lot, that seems to me still a kind of open question. Because I became very invested in this book, in an ethics of identification, I had to wonder at the end of my remarks whether that is still plausible or even possible given the current world situation. I think I'll stop there. So thank you. So that leaves a lot of time for questions and discussion, which I understand I was supposed to leave. I don't know if they're all going to be questions. They can be discussion. Yes?
In my own conceptions and working through my personal understanding of World War II, I kind of came away with this working hypothesis that the atomic bombs were dropped primarily for positioning ourselves for post-war negotiations with Russia. And I see how opposing views to that. Time and time again, I'm pointing toward Truman's memoirs. And I can't think of a less reliable source. I mean, even if he believes what he's created to be his understanding of why he ordered the bomb struck, I just can't imagine that's the piece that solves the problem.
As you know, that's been a very vexed question, a very vexed issue for a long time. The immediate perception of upon the bombings in the United States was, great, we don't have to invade Japan. Okinawa had not been a pretty invasion. It had been very costly in terms of American lives. It was really messy. And the troops that came back from Europe, I don't have the exact statistics in my mind, but if you were not discharged, you were getting ready to go do the Japanese invasion. So one can totally understand a joyous reaction that had been preempted. So I totally understand that. There's a book called Hiroshima's Shadow, which has a lot of the documentary evidence. And again, is this accidental or is this not? This is one of the editors is named Kai Bird. And he and the other co-editor are very noted scholars of World War II. Couldn't get the book published anywhere, so they're published by the Pamphleteer Press or something like that. But it's a great collection. And it makes several cases. One is that, yes, there was this popular sentiment for dropping let's not do the invasion. That sounds terrible. Let's not do it. And it'll save Japanese lives, too. But the more persuasive is the argument that you've put out, which is that we've got these fantastic things. Let's see how they work. It's a great opportunity to see how they work. My own theory, and it's not one that I can scientifically prove, but when you've invested as much time and money in developing things like that, they're going to get used. Just like when you've amassed troops on the border of Iraq, the invasion's going to happen. You have to sort of stop sooner before kind of a momentum moves things through. At some point, we may know the answer to that one, but I don't know.
One of the things that's compelling for me is my understanding.
It's my understanding that Japan, before the bombs were dropped, was apparently willing to surrender under the condition that the emperor keep his place.
Yeah, which the Americans were not.
Isn't it the case that even after the bombs were surrendered, the emperor kept his place?
Yes,
So really
all of that is true. All of that is true. All of that is true. And of course, the bombs were being developed because we thought the Nazis were going to get there first. So it's a really messy history. And Albert Einstein, you've seen those letters where he was at first urging the development of the bomb, and then horrified by its potential. So it's all there. I'm inclined to agree with you that it was very, very tempting just to see what those things would do. And part of what I see as instantiating the war complex is, we come out of the war, we've got the bomb, our infrastructure's intact. It doesn't last very long. The Soviets have the bomb by, is it 49? And then the hydrogen bomb gets developed in 53, and then the Soviets have the bomb 3 months later. So it's just, it seems to me almost tragic to have gone down that road and to have had, I would say people living under the shadow, except I think there was a long period where people did not feel that, like, you know, from about 1989 to about 2001, I think people did not feel threatened with that kind of mass destruction. Yes?
Yes, I've also heard the argument that so many Japanese cities were totally destroyed by
Yes.
conventional bombing
Yes.
raids, 1,000-plane
Yes.
raids,
Yes.
that they were ready to continue fighting. But it was the destruction of the Kwangtung army in Mongolia, in Manchuria, where the Russians totally destroyed that force that finally persuaded the Japanese to seek some sort of peace. That was the last great ground force they had.
That I actually didn't know, but I do know that the incendiary bombings of Tokyo claimed more lives than either Hiroshima or Nagasaki individually. My Fulbright was in Japan, so it was kind of wonderful to tour Japan in 2010, where, I mean, Hiroshima, you can't tell anything happened there. That city has been not just rebuilt, but it's quite magnificent. But the city of my heart in Japan was Kyoto, and some of you probably know that there was a list of, I forget whether it was 10 cities, 12 cities, that had not been bombed, and so they were testing where would we drop the atomic bomb. And I think it was the Secretary of State took Kyoto off the list, saying the world will never forgive you if you destroy this city. And that's one reason why Hiroshima ended up with the choice. Nagasaki was actually an accident, as I understand it. The weather conditions made it the choice, and they picked something else.
Yes.
You look like that's not true. That may
Oh, I'm
not.
sorry, I was watching it. I'm sorry, what
Yeah.
did you say?
Oh, never mind. That's not.
No, I agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
But Nagasaki was hilly, so the blast was.
And it was contained. Yeah, it was a different kind of effect. Yeah.
I'm originally from the Congo,
Mm-hmm.
and I have learned and experienced more people dying there, not from gas,
Mm-hmm.
not from atomic bombs. And in terms of critical thinking in the classroom, the ethics of war, and I'd like to hear through your experience and research and how you may address that ethics of war in the classroom. And I see the discussion today being conventional weapons may be better than unconventional war.
But it could be. It
So
could be.
what is more?
It could be. It's up close and personal and ugly when it's not.
How do you
Well, again, I'm not an expert, and I don't want to claim more authority than I actually have, but it seems to me that the ethics of war require the depersonalization of the enemy, that you cannot acknowledge the enemy as a human being like you. So the first thing that needs to happen is that there's a kind of us-theming that happens, and we are one kind of being, and they are a different kind of being. From my understanding, there's oftentimes a kind of label which is applied, whether it's a tribal label, a group level label, a political label. And then there has to be, on the basis, there has to be a kind of a mass intoxication that takes place, and sometimes it's a literal intoxication where whiskey and alcohol kick in or drug kicks in, and sometimes it's just a kind of group fervor, which allows people to do things that they would never do. The Einsatz group in Germany were that way. They would drink, and then they would kill people. Some of the genocides in Rwanda and in the Congo, in my understanding, have taken place around that kind of that othering of people and a refusal to consider them as part of a sympathetic empathy. The closer the relations, the harder it is, but it's not impossible. I mean, I know that neighbor can turn on neighbor seemingly for irrational means. I mean, it's one of the not so pleasant mysteries of human nature, which is why, for me, an ethics of empathy and ethics of identification, well, it shouldn't be applied wholesale. You know, not everyone is deserving of your empathy. I mean, the people who commit these murders, I might never feel like I could really do that. I don't really think I could. I think it's a kind of cop-out to say that I could do it. But if you can, I mean, all religions have some version of consider others like yourself, like your family. And if one could do that as a global citizen, it would make it much harder for these kinds of things to take place. But I take your point that there's something about dropping a bomb or sending a missile which is very sanitary compared to hand-to-hand combat or using a machete on another being, which is very up close and personal. And also some of the other, like the use of systematic rapes, the use of killing of children in front of parents. And that's just, it's a gratuitous level of cruelty which is very hard to understand.
Why is there some popularity of DDay, or what is known militarily as Operation Overlord, when the Southern Operation Liberate, for instance, is not hardly ever talked about as Operation Dragoon? My own was killed almost 28,000 in that operation. And so you don't hear much about it.
Again, it's speculation. Part of it, my skills as an English professor, I thought was somewhat useful. D-Day, it's a singular event. It begins at midnight on this. They launch the ships from England at midnight, and then they go through the following day. So it's got the classic unities of place, time, and action that say Greek drama does. So I think that's part of why it was so important. The other is that, and again, you kind of feel this when you go to D-Day, there was so much ingenuity involved, the ability to build those submerged harbors and to build them in England and put them underwater so they couldn't be seen, and then to tow them and assemble them quickly, the element of surprise that was there. So I think it has to do with that, sort of the dramatic unity of it, the amount of creative energy around it. And I don't know who was in charge of the invasion of the South. That counts too. General Eisenhower was in charge of D-Day, and Eisenhower was both. If you've seen the letter he wrote before ordering the invasion, because the weather was very iffy, the weather might have ditched it. He wrote a really touching letter claiming all responsibility. And then Eisenhower, I grew up thinking, as a college student, I thought he was a kind of joke. But when I heard him give that 1961 farewell address where he talked about the military-industrial complex, I thought, this is a man of great vision and great wisdom. So I think it's the force of somebody like Eisenhower as well. But it's very hard to say. It's really hard to say. Did it follow D-Day?
It did. They landed in August, the last part of July and early August, and then the major battle that they made the Metropolis Hill was August 28th, so maybe mid-August when they actually landed.
And was the Battle of the Bulge taking place at the same time?
I don't recall.
Well, the war was over in May, right?
It was the following year.
Okay. So, many more dramatic things might have been happening elsewhere, and it just didn't get the attention. I honestly don't know.
I know Winston Churchill was not fond of that Southern operation, and that's why they called it Operation Dragoon, because he said he was dragooned into it.
Oh. Well, he was a powerful man, too, a powerful personality.
I wasn't really interested in the actual numbers, but what they would say about who lost, what the percentages were. And the actual numbers are the U.S. lost 58,000 men, and the Vietnamese between 1.5 million to 3 million. And I would say 2/3 of my students guessed that either the Americans lost more, or their figures were about comparable. And that's pretty staggering when you think about the difference.
It's really staggering. Yeah.
Honestly, this is different. We're talking over lunch about the Holocaust. Lunch conversation.
It's all light conversation when it's World War II. It's just wonderful.
Some of us older colleagues don't remember having been taught about the Holocaust in school, and the younger colleague definitely remembers it. So that was my sense too, that in the first decade after the Second World War, so it really wasn't a prominent part of the curriculum or talked about much. Can you speak to that?
I think that's true. I mean, those photographs were around and were in circulation, but they were always kind of like a dirty secret, and people didn't show them. It's like, don't tell the children kind of thing that surrounded them. The breakthrough there was the Anne Frank story, which was the first wedge into public attention. And there again, it's an individual within a family, a fetching individual within a family, and people who were, and the point was made over and over again in discussions of Anne Frank, people who were like us. They only lit the Hanukkah candles. They didn't even like the Shabbat candles. You're right that there was a kind of delayed memory thing. The trial of Adolf Eichmann, and this did surprise me because I was reading Life magazine, but apparently there were nightly TV broadcasts of the trial in the New York area, and weekly broadcasts elsewhere. I wasn't watching them, so I wasn't aware of those at the time. I did go back and look at some of them, and they were interesting. So the trial of Adolf Eichmann was there too, and that's 1961. But the cliche about the Holocaust has always been Adorno's "No poetry after Auschwitz," and I think for decades people assumed that there could be no poetry after Auschwitz, there could be no representation, and of course it was nonsense. There had been lots of representation happening all the time. I think the date is 1978. There was a TV drama called Holocaust. It was around the same time as Roots. Anybody seen that? You're there, okay, great. I've never seen it, and it was very controversial because they would cut from the Holocaust, and it was all structured about family narratives again, always a family narrative, and they would cut to Maidenform bra ads, and it was considered disrespectful, and so there was much more stuff about that. But then something happens around the 90s, and that's where I would actually put a major change in Holocaust memory. And it's the founding of the Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., which I believe is 93, maybe 92, and then Schindler's List in 93. And then after that, like it's Spielberg is funding the gathering of testimony, and it becomes quite abundant.
I guess it gets pressing, right, as you begin to recognize that survivors are really dying off.
Yeah, and I think that would be part of it. The idea that the testimony would come in. And again, I'm going to veer into controversy, which I didn't intend to do today. And one of the things which surprised me very much as I was working on the Holocaust was how, on the one hand, it had become a topic which it isn't drummed into Americans the way it is into German children, for instance. They don't consider it a boring topic the way that many German children do. But there is a sense in which there's a kind of piety that surrounds the Holocaust. And it surprised me very much when I was doing this book that some figures who have done really important scholarly work on the Holocaust, like Raoul Hilberg, the dean of Holocaust studies, who did a book called The Destruction of European Jewry, one of the first big histories. He published a very modest book as I was writing this book, in which he pointed out what I thought was I couldn't contest it, that not all Holocaust testimony was true, that some of it was recounting rumors. And the establishment went crazy over him. They just went nuts over him. And it really challenged his status. Norman Finkelstein, who's another important figure in Holocaust studies, wrote a book called The Holocaust Industry, where he was talking about concentration camp tourism. And a fact that I find astonishing, that grave plots are sold, and some Jews want to be buried in Auschwitz, which I find an astonishing thing. And he's just writing about these things. And again, the establishment just went ballistic. I was very surprised. And of course, the figure I was most interested in, because of not my attachment to Eichmann, but my fascination with Eichmann, was Hannah Arendt. And you can still mention Hannah Arendt to people, and some people want to spit. Well, exactly what's that about? But still to this day, and she's been dead for how long, and she's obviously a brilliant woman. And Eichmann in Jerusalem, there are things, she's thumbing her nose.
Eichmann is
No, they spit at her because she points out the guilt of some of the Jewish councils in selecting citizens to be deported. And she says, and it's a very Hannah Arendt thing to say, that many people would have died in the Holocaust, but not as many if the Jewish elders had not neatly deported people to the camps. That was the primary reason the people. And when you read the book, I mean, she goes over all the many reasons why they might do that, including, you know, the most immediate regard for their own families. And she doesn't discount any of that, but that was the primary reason. And of course, the Eichmann as ordinary has been overused, but the book is, I find it a dazzling book every time I read it.
Before I give it Mike, one more thing. When you mentioned the bra commercials and the Holocaust, it reminded me of that broadcast of Judgment of Nuremberg in the 50s. And you know that story where the American gas company sponsored it every now and again. They wouldn't allow references to gas to be mentioned during the broadcast.
I did not know that.
I thought it was apocryphal, but I first saw it.
I don't know. And then, of course, we had that wonderful remark, you know, was it yesterday? Was it only yesterday? Do you want to discuss? I mean, are there wonderful memories of World War II or families in World War II that you want to share?